Welcome to the HERHealth Podcast, transforming health for women and girls at risk, where we empower women and girls to take charge of their health and well-being. Join us as we shine a spotlight on issues affecting women and girls' health and explore ways to create positive change. Get ready to be inspired and empowered as we discuss health, advocacy, and empowerment for women and girls at risk. Please be advised that this podcast may cover sensitive topics such as gendered violence. We understand that these discussions can be difficult to listen to. If you feel uncomfortable or need support, we encourage you to prioritize your well-being. Consider exploring our other podcasts if these topics are triggering for you. Resources can be found in the description.
Okay, so hi everyone. Welcome to the HERHealth Podcast, where we explore the people, the programs driving change across health and social systems for women, girls, and gender diverse people impacted by violence and adversity. I'm your host, Alexandria Lazocek, and today's conversation is all about shifting culture, one choice, one voice, and one intervention at a time. Our guest is Nolan Hill, a training center facilitator at the Centre for Sexuality in Calgary. Nolan brings expertise in sexual health education, queer health, HIV advocacy, and 2S LGBTQIA+ community development. He is deeply committed to health justice, ensuring that queer and trans voices are not only heard, but centered in health system transformation. In this episode, we'll be talking about creating a culture of consent, what that means in practice, how to become an engaged bystander, and the tools we all need to challenge harassment, empower survivors, and build safer communities for everyone. Well, thank you so much, Nolan, for coming today. I really appreciate it.
Happy to be here.
Great. We're going to dive in. So, culture of consent is a powerful phrase, but it's often misunderstood. So, I'm wondering how you define it. What are some key ingredients to building one in our workplace, schools, or communities?
Yeah, I think with the culture of consent, we have a lot of culture in our world. We're surrounded by different forms of culture and cultures. And the culture of consent is really about shifting the way in which we interact with each other to really respect people's autonomy, people's boundaries, and respect that consent of what that actually looks like in all interactions with people. I think some of the key ingredients are the education around what consent actually is, because it's often misunderstood. And it's about making sure that people understand what their rights are, how that translates really to their boundaries, and also how people get to communicate about consent. Because people often are unsure about how to actually say no or say that, I want to consent in this way or that way. So I think the culture shift in that sort of phrase, the key ingredients are really education, equipping people with skills and tools, and making sure that we're kind of all on board and that we get to raise the bar on how we have conversations with each other and how we interact with each other.
Thank you so much for kind of setting the stage of what culture of education and communication about consent is. I really appreciate it. Your webinar really dives into like the root causes of sexual violence. Can you share some of the systemic or cultural factors that create conditions where harm is normalized or even ignored?
Absolutely. When we think about the sort of setting the stage for violence, it's really about systems of oppression and inequity that exist in our world. So it's racism, sexism, homophobia, biphobia, and transphobia, ableism, other forms of discrimination that have been the foundation of our world, and have been the foundation of the way in which we interact with each other and the way in which many of our systems are built. So when we think about that sort of setup for sexual violence and how that occurs, it's because people live in worlds and in a culture where people are permitted to, and it's often normalized, to treat people with disrespect based upon their identities, based upon what communities or groups they might belong to. So when we're addressing those root causes, we have to recognize that they're big picture things that we need to address. It's not an individual saying, I just don't like this particular group of people. It's the way in which our world is unfortunately structured. And there's lots of ways that we're challenging this and looking to change it. But it is a long game. And we have to recognize that it takes that unlearning and it takes that critical reflection of how we really want to interact with each other as human beings and start to break down and recognize the impact of the differences in experiences and identities, and how we can really, again, look at that root human experience of everyone's lives, and be able to treat people with respect and you know it's really respect. Like, that is kind of the main word that I think about at the human level, which is often not the norm, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for diving in. I know that in your webinar you talked about, there's different phrases, but I usually go for the sexual violence pyramid, especially with all the isms that create discrimination and create like sexual violence at the bottom. And one thing that was really emphasized to me when I was learning about it for the first time is that if we remove all the norms and we don't allow the spaces to have all those negative talk or allow for, I'm trying to think, just negative words or values to exist, then violence won't exist because we allowed for none of the isms to exist in the spaces that we occupy. And I'm curious what that kind of means to be an engaged bystander and why it's really critical, a critical role. And why is this like role of an engaged bystander so critical when creating environments that actively prevent harm?
Yeah, and that's a super important question, because, as you mentioned, like, if we erode the bottom level, if we erode the bedrock of violence and harm, then the rest crumbles. And ultimately, it's that sort of language of disrespect, those stereotypes, those norms that are enabled in our communities, that if we start to challenge those and eliminate those, in theory, then we crumble sort of everything that is on top of it, which can be more extreme forms of violence, violence that causes physical harm, that type of thing. And when we think about being an engaged bystander, that can actually be some of the, not going to say easier, but some of the more accessible ways in which we can actually engage in our engaged bystander work, because we might not actually see a lot of physical violence that happens. We might not actually see those more extreme forms of violence as commonly, but we do probably see every single day examples of people who are, saying disrespectful things, doing disrespectful things, holding those values and those attitudes that lead to disrespect, where we can see them pretty plainly. We have to be able to detect them and be able to recognize them. But if we're able to really take a look at the people in our communities, the people in our lives, and be able to hold everyone to a bit of a higher standard of treating other people with respect, with kindness, with integrity, all those things, then we're able to also intervene at the other levels when we see it as well. So that if we start at the bottom, it's a little bit more accessible, because it's, your problematic, friend's partner who maybe is saying some things, and kind of everyone around you, and maybe you're all on the same page. It's a little bit more accessible to say something to that problematic partner, than to, maybe for safety reasons or maybe for lots of other reasons, intervene when there's more extreme forms of violence that are happening. So I think with engaged bystander work, it's recognized that all the levels of intervention are really valid and important, but it can be a little bit more accessible to think about, how can I do those little small acts? It doesn't feel like I'm having to climb a mountain, right?
Mm-hmm. Thank you for speaking about that more eloquently than I was trying to explain before. I really appreciate it. And talking about like when we're kind of maybe confronting a situation that may feel unsafe or unsure about or fear, we might make things worse. What are some like our common barriers that prevent bystander action, and how can we overcome them?
Absolutely. The biggest thing to overcome them is being aware of them, and being able to kind of name them for ourselves. We might think, oh, this barrier, it's insurmountable. But if we're able to say, that's the barrier that I'm experiencing, we're able to hopefully work through it and maybe create some proactive measures to say, I know that I want to intervene in these situations, so I'm going to, practice or develop some skills for myself. It can be things like being anxious or feeling that you're unsafe, if you intervene, we want to make sure safety is paramount for everyone involved. So putting ourselves in harm's way is not going to be able to help other people if we're getting harmed. But it can be things like, oh, this isn't my role. Someone else is supposed to do this. We all have a role to play in creating safer and more respectful communities. So we have to start seeing everything as our role, while also recognizing that sometimes there's skills that we don't have. So it's about a bit of a navigation in that space. There's a lot of social norms about, particularly when it comes to sex and sexual violence, that it's not my business. Other people, what goes on in their lives is none of my business. But when other people are experiencing harm and our communities are experiencing violence and harm, that becomes everyone's business. So I think it's important to be able to recognize, again, these barriers like that anxiety, that lack of comfort with the role, that feeling that it's none of my business, some of those social norms, starting to reflect on the why those are causing us to have a barrier to intervene in some way. And think about what are our core values about how we want to create safety in our communities. If we sit back and we really think for ourselves, I want my communities to feel safer. I want all of my friends, my family, the people in my community to feel that they can engage in their communities in safe ways, then I do have to actually step outside of my comfort zone a little bit, step into that stretch zone, feel a little bit of discomfort without maybe feeling unsafe, to hopefully create that safety in the communities that we're all a part of.
Definitely. When you say stretch zone, I definitely think of Stafford's presentation last week where he talked about safe and stretch zone. So thanks for pulling that back. I appreciate it. I also really appreciated in your webinar talking about supporting after harm with like the RNR, reassure, normalize, and remember acronym. I really like that, and I'll probably hold on to that. So I'm really curious, like the training you specifically talked about highlighted strategies for intervening in ways that empower the person being harmed. And so I was just wondering what that looks like in practice.
Absolutely. As I mentioned in the webinar, there's a bit of a tendency for folks to really just want to say, I'm going to go yell at the person who's causing harm. I'm going to maybe say mean things to them, or, fight back against the person or the entity that's causing harm, rather than thinking about how we can support that person who's experienced harm. And that model of that sort of first aid, you would never yell at the staircase that someone has fallen down and saying, why would you do this? You're such a bad staircase. You would go and support the person who's fallen down the stairs. And with things like the reassure, normalize, remember, and supporting people after they've experienced harm, it's about working with someone, not necessarily working, for them, and connecting with what feels right for you. So this is, again, asking good questions, being open to listen, and listen to what that sounds like for that person. We might have a way that we would respond if we were in a similar situation, and then we might ask a friend, a community member, whoever that might be, how do you want to go about this? And they say something completely different, and we have to be okay with that being different. Particularly with sexual violence, there is often a lot of pressure for folks to report, to involve things like law enforcement, when we know that the vast majority of incidences of sexual violence are never reported to police, because there's a lot of barriers in that system, and it's not always the right fit for everyone. So I think that can be a really key thing for us to unlearn a bit, is that the only way to address harm is to punish other people through some sort of system. And I think there's lots of great work being done by many individuals, communities, organizations, and there's sort of this movement towards what does justice actually look like in a more restorative way, and a more transformative way, and not always thinking that things have to be punitive. So I think to put it into practice is really about being open to listen to what other people might need. And it's not always going to align with what we might think. It might cause us to have to really step back and unlearn some things. And that is actually the beauty of it, is if we're able to have the space to hold for people and to say, tell me what you need, and I will support in the ways that I can. I think that can be really transformative for the person who's experienced harm, to just be able to share what they need, for us to be able to hear that and to be able to say, here's what I can do, here's what I'm able to do, and here's what is within maybe my power. And then being able to connect the dots between those things. It's really about making sure that the lead is thinking about those rights, thinking about, can people access their communities in ways that feel good and feel appropriate and right for them, and navigating what that looks like for everyone. We all inherently have these rights that we want people to be able to access, and saying, because you've caused harm, you can't actually access any rights anymore. It's not about give and take. It's about, how do we all come together to create that sort of vision for a shared future that feels, that it is a place for everyone, right? So
Definitely. You very powerful in how simple it is just to say you have to be open to listen, and what you think some person may need is not what they actually want. And working with someone and not for someone was very powerful. So thank you so much for diving into that. I'm very much curious of like how you approach consent education and bystander training in ways that are inclusive of 2S LGBTQIA communities and peoples, and how these practices are grounded in trauma-informed practices.
absolutely. With all communities that experience sexual violence, which is every community, regardless of experience and identity, we have to think about that sort of trauma and violence informed approach, where recognizing that this is an issue that affects the community, and not seeking to be experts in that. We don't have to be trauma therapists in order to have these conversations with our communities. We have to be aware that, and really integrate this into our work and into my work as well, that people have experienced harm, people have experienced trauma and violence. So we have to try to respond in ways and care for people and have conversations with people in ways that acknowledge that and try not to, have that happen again, recognizing that that's not always the easiest thing to do, but it is something we can strive for. And when we work with particularly 2S LGBTQIA plus communities, that's a lot of our foundation in the work that we do at the Center for Sexuality, is working with 2S LGBTQIA plus people, individuals, communities, all those things. And I'm actually particularly interested in the ways in which the influence of some of those heteronormative and cisnormative narratives about sex and sexuality come into an interesting tension with relationships in 2S LGBTQIA plus communities. A lot of the education and a lot of the messaging that is out there about sexual violence is very rooted in power imbalances and violence between two binary genders. So when you get two people who might have a shared gender experience, two men, two women, two people who are even outside of those binary genders, the scripts don't necessarily exist in those spaces. So I think with our education, we're always trying to be inclusive and say, and name that sexual violence does happen to all communities, people of all genders, people of all sexual orientations. And not because that person is, a 2S LGBTQIA plus person, but because of the systems in which we live in, which enable homophobia, biphobia, transphobia, sexism, racism, ableism. Because of those fundamental sort of structures, they create a condition in which the experience of violence can be maybe more heightened or sometimes more common. There's still a long way to go in these conversations before we're able to truly get a grasp of exactly how deeply this issue does impact communities that are not straight and not cisgender. But I think we're moving towards that and starting to, unearth some of those fundamental challenges around how we talk about prevention of sexual violence, because I know, as you know, as a gay man, a lot of the messaging that I got growing up was that, you know, men are perpetrators, women, like this was, you know, 20 years ago, that it doesn't happen between men. And then in being a part of queer communities, we see it happens. We know it does happen between people of all genders, and any person could experience violence, or could be a person who causes harm or perpetrates harm. So we've really got to start to untangle those pieces and have better conversations within what prevention looks like. And I think we're starting to do that. We're trying to do that as best we can, but I think there's still a long way to go in terms of developing how that actually shows up in our communities.
Absolutely. It just reminded me, a colleague at the Child Studies Lab wrote a paper about misconceptions about 2S LGBTQIA relationships when talking about domestic violence, and that really opened up my eyes. That a lot of individuals were speaking about how they mistrust police and how they just feel like the violence isn't taken as seriously when it's not between a man and a woman, or like cis heteronormative relationships. So thank you so much. I feel, yeah, the lines are connecting. So I'm glad to see more of this research coming out, but definitely more is definitely needed, especially to the general public as a whole. So thank you for diving into that. Kind of talking about the general public, what are some like kind of simple but very powerful tools or language that people can use in everyday situations, either at work, on their way to transit, or in social settings to step up or step in and show support?
Yeah, I think, you know, an example that it's interesting you mentioned transit is, I think an interesting sort of example that I've thought about that's very like low kind of bar, low stakes in a lot of ways, is the ways in which people interact when someone's trying to get out the back door of a bus that won't open, and the bus driver doesn't realize that. And then they start driving away. And then there's 20 other people on the bus, but it's often left up to that person who's trying to get out the back door to say, hey, no, I'm trying to get off this bus. And that was a bit of a moment many years ago that I had, recognizing that bystander intervention is an important part of preventing violence and harassment, but there's lots of things we can do to just make our communities safer, more accessible, more comfortable, where, you know, where we can say, oh, hey, this person might need some support. It doesn't always have to be where someone is experiencing a form of violence or harm. There's simple ways that we can start to speak out and say, oh, this person needs help, the best we can. And I think the sort of language that I think about is just recognizing that sort of consent is a part of all our lives in day-to-day situations. Can I ask you a question? Can I give you a hug? Can I help you with that? Can I, you know, asking for consent rather than just assuming consent. I think it's a subtle shift in language that we could all do with to really incorporate consent into our day-to-day interactions. It's not always just about sex, but not just assuming that a person is going to want to provide us with information or want to have a conversation. There might be situations where people just assume that someone's going to say yes, but they might say no. And we have to also develop a bit of that resilience to respond to no, and have, you know, a way to negotiate that, because, you know, we have to practice being able to hear a no and say, oh, okay, and be able to move forward from that where possible. You know, sometimes there's situations where there's a real tension between someone doesn't want to provide information, but there's policies that we need to make sure that that person provides that information. I think about like in healthcare settings, for example, you know, if you don't have a healthcare card, unfortunately, we can't serve you. That's a tension, but we need to figure out how do we move forward with that in a good way without being super dismissive, and honoring what people's boundaries are or what people's no's might sound like or look like. So it's just those subtle shifts of language that's a broad kind of cultural shift that I think we could all do for. And I really hope that as our communities continue to have conversations about sexual violence, we begin to plant those seeds about what consent looks like in a lot of different ways, and what no sounds like, and what no looks like, and what no means. People don't always think that no mean, or people mostly think no means someone doesn't like me, they're rejecting me, and that's a negative thing. It can just be they're sharing their boundary. They don't want to go to a coffee for a coffee with you because they don't have the time. Doesn't mean they don't like you, doesn't mean they don't want to maybe go for dinner that evening. It's just a no being a part of our lexicon that we're pretty bad at hearing, but we're working towards hopefully getting a better understanding of what no looks, sounds, and feels like.
Definitely. It's really interesting to see how that shift of culture of like no is not necessarily always a negative connotation towards the person that you're saying no to is really interesting to see how that will change our communities in the future. And hopefully we have less of those tensions going forward. So kind of talking about going forward, what gives you hope about this type of work? And I know you mentioned earlier, what are some actions you wish more people would take to help build a culture of consent in their daily lives?
That's a really excellent question. And what does give me hope is that there has been change in some ways. I think there's a lot of things that haven't changed, and there's still a long way to go. But I can think about having done work in this space and worked in communities for over 10 years now. We are having different conversations than we were having 5 years ago, than we were having 10 years ago. It can be very subtle shifts that are happening that sometimes feel like they're like very tiny wins, and they're a 1 grain of sand out of a whole desert full of challenges that we might need to face. But I do think that gives me hope in that we might not see the end of a particular issue in my lifetime, but that grain of sand, that one little piece of the puzzle, is starting to progress something towards a better future. And the kind of overall hope that I have for people to integrate this into their lives, or what I would love to see is just to continue to ask those good questions, to continue to have good communication, to look to people who are, it sounds kind of corny, but like the children of tomorrow, equipping them with the skills and tools. I certainly didn't always get the greatest lessons or education or things about how to engage in ways that feel good for me. I've had to do unlearning. And if we can start with younger folks and equipping them with as best the tools that we have at this point, they're going to continue to have to unlearn things, but they're going to be able to start from a different place than we started from. And we can slowly, kind of generationally, hopefully shift our cultures towards that better future, where we're not always starting over from scratch. It's kind of every generation, every entry into community is a little bit of a building block onto each other to hopefully create those safer and inclusive futures that we all hopefully want to see.
Yeah, and I could also see how unlearning would become easier with the different generations of just, oh, I'm coming with this humility. I did not know that. And then we start using proper respect for one another. Well, thank you. I thank you so much for diving into that. I was just curious, is there anything else that we might have missed or anything you'd like to discuss today?
I think it's been really interesting to have this conversation, and I just encourage folks to reflect for themselves about how you want your relationships and your communities to look. And that includes when it comes to consent and healthy relationships in that way, but also about, how do we want to create safer spaces for folks who experience discrimination, other forms of harassment that are not necessarily sexual violence related, but really just reflect on what do we want our communities to look like. And I think if we really all kind of take a good hard look at that, we'd be able to see we can kind of have this almost utopian view, and there's no shame of striving for the pie in the sky goals. It can be really easy to get kind of jaded or discouraged by the worlds that we live in and coming up against the challenges, but coming back to that, what do I actually want to see? How can I help realize that in my community? And do what we can with what we have. Whether it comes to sexual violence, whether it comes to, creating safer spaces for in other spaces, other communities. We really want to reflect on the world we want to see and be able to work towards what that looks like, and what we can control, what we can contribute to, and not necessarily get too discouraged by the world that we might come across or face.
Well, thank you so much, Nolan, for joining me on the HERHealth podcast. Thank you so much. And I'll make sure to add the webinar and everything to the description down below. Was there anything else you would like to add in our little description that we can highlight too?
Yeah, just feel free to connect with the Center for Sexuality. If folks have any questions, we're happy to connect with folks who are doing this work and want to do this work or have questions about this work. We're always happy to have those conversations.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us on the HERHealth Podcast, transforming health for women and girls at risk. Remember, your health matters, and together we can make a difference. Until next time, remember to prioritize your health and well-being. For more resources and support on issues affecting girls, women, and gender-diverse people, visit our website at avatraining.ca. This is Dr. Nicole Letourneau. Thank you for listening.